Hij zal dit proefschrift nu verdedigen. En ik vraag aan de kandidaat eerst een uiteenzetting van ongeveer 45 minuten te geven, uiteraard over zijn werk. En daarna zal er gelegenheid zijn tot het maken van opmerkingen en het stellen van vragen. Antoon, u hebt het woord.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear members of the jury, colleagues, family, friends. It's a pleasure, really, to have you here at the public defense of my PhD dissertation entitled Cache Side Channel Attacks on Existing and Emerging Computing Platforms. Now, before we tear apart this title, let's start with a thought experiment. So imagine for me, please, that you are a burglar and you want to break into a house. You already found the house, but of course you want to be a good burglar and you want to break in when the people that live there are not home. Okay? Of course, you're also a good burglar. You're not going to ask them, are you home? That would not be stealthy enough. But maybe there's some extra information you can use with which you can make an educated guess. These people who live here, are they home or not? Maybe it's evening and the lights are out. Maybe they used to park their car there and the car is now no longer there. Maybe they have letters piling out of the mailbox. All of these things don't directly say you're not home, but they allow for, an educated guess. In real life, we call something like that paying attention, but there's also a technical term for what I just described, and the technical term is side channels. And that's what this dissertation is about. Okay, paying attention, side channels. So a side channel is using information, extra information, unintended information to infer some extra main thing that you are after. Now, side channels, of course, typically are stealthy. So if you want to break into a house, you're not announcing it. And if you use a side channel, you're not necessarily exposing that to anyone else. If you check the lights, that's not something you are necessarily revealing. Side channels are also typically, or by definition, indirect. That's what makes them a side channel, or in Dutch, nevenkanaal, zijkanaal. Because you're not reading the information explicitly, but you're kind of deducing it, you're kind of inferring it. And there's another side channel that I think many people use. Maybe you've used it now and got a heart attack. So it's here in the bottom right corner of the slide. This is a side channel I use a lot, taking the total number of slides and then making a deduction. How long is this going to take? Rest assured, and this is one of the final takeaways, side channels can be wrong, okay? So they're probabilistic. I don't have 2,379 slides, but maybe something close to it. You'll see. All right. So paying attention is important in daily life, and what I want to convince you of today is that paying attention is also important in other contexts. And so one very important side channel or means of paying attention is time, which I also aim to convince you of today. And if we complete this layman's version of my title, it would be paying attention to time on computers. But why are computers relevant? Why should we pay attention? Why should we pay attention to time? Well, there's a few trends in computing and society that we're observing. And the first is that computers, we entrust them with our secrets, right? They have our keys, they have our passwords, they have our communications, they have our financial transactions. Another trend is that computers are increasingly shared. So there's software programs by different stakeholders, different parties, increasingly running on the same machine. When I say computer, by the way, I mean any type of computing device, so a smartphone or a server, all of that is in scope. And all of these are getting increasingly shared, and especially, of course, in the cloud, there it's part of the business model. Let's place as many software entities as possible on the same physical platform. Now, what we've also learned, maybe painstakingly over the last decade or so, is that sharing computers is not necessarily as harmless as we thought it was. And if we put software by different parties on the same computing device, for instance, in the cloud, on your laptop or whatever, They should be isolated from another, so they shouldn't be able to read each other's information. But as we're learning through side channels, this isolation is often violated, and that will be the topic of today. So paying attention to time on computers, that's our title. So now there's one more thing you need to know to understand the rest of this talk and the rest of my contributions. It's not that hard, it's just how a computer works. Okay, this is fairly trivial. Now, of course, it is not. So the computer, again, computing device, the hardware. So the hardware is the part you can touch, the part you can bang your head against if it doesn't do what you want. And then the software, the programs, is what's running on top of them. And where most of the magic happens is within the processor or CPU. Okay, this is the chip, the part that gets hot. This is where most of the magic happens, most of the computations happen, and most of the interesting things, in my opinion. Now, these processors are very, very complicated. I mean, they're man-made, but they're impossible to fully grasp, almost. So for this talk, I'm trying to, at risk of oversimplification maybe, describe them to you as factories. Okay? And you can take that quite literally. This is very complicated. So this is a floor plan of a recent Intel CPU. To me, that looks much, much more sophisticated than the real factories we face. But this is the kind of ordeal we're talking about, and no human on the planet understands all of these things simultaneously. But if all that is so complex, how can we still use our computing devices for useful things? Well, first maybe, so these factories, these computers, they have machines. Factories have machines. These machines produce useful output from useful input, right? And in a processor, in a processor factory, that would be like adding two numbers, multiplying numbers, and so on. And then there's also an important part is that the right things happen at the right time. And this is, you can see this as the control room, right? The control flow. First this is happening, then that is happening, and so on. And to produce, for our factory, to produce some useful output from inputs, we of course need these inputs, and those are data, represented by boxes here, and instructions. But as I said, all of this is so complex. How can we use it properly? How can we do things in real life with it? And for that, we have abstraction layers. So we have different layers of software on top. Software, this is writing code that makes the machine do useful things. There are different abstraction layers here. There are also different abstraction layers to the bottom. So this processor, this microarchitecture is described in hardware, and so on, translated, translated, translated. Everyone, this is a specialty of like, if you want to grasp this, this is a specialty, like one of these abstraction layers. But it allows us to do useful things, and it also allows one layer to make optimizations without affecting the other layers too much. And this way we can transparently increase the performance of our systems. And this is exactly what's been happening. So many of the advances in computing have been due to advances in materials and manufacturing, technology, and so on. So our factory has been getting better and better and better over time. So this is an exponential curve, which you all recognize at this point. And this is all fine. This is Moore's law. This is fantastic, except there's one part that hasn't kept up to the same degree, and that's memory. So if our machines are getting faster and faster and faster, there's one thing that hasn't gotten faster, and that's shipping, right? That's getting the packets, getting the data in and out of the factory. So shipping is very slow compared to how fast our machines are. Is there a way we can solve this? And so if our factory needs some data, needs a box, well, it asks for the box to memory with a specific address, which you can think of as a serial number of the box. And then it will be fetched from memory. This is slow. But what if we could have an extra component here in the hardware of the processor? And that is called a cache. So, and this component will ensure that the boxes that are needed soon for the factory are close. And so if the factory has recently used this box, what will happen is that this box will now be in the cache, and future references to this box will be fast. And this is fantastic, and this almost single-handedly solves the memory bottleneck problem I described on the previous slide. You may also notice that cache was in the title, so there will be an important weight on caches. And so let's now try to understand them a little bit better. So how does this magic work? So again, if we have our factory, it needs a box from memory. What would be nice if it would be in the cache? Okay, but how do we implement this magical cache object? Well, of course, this box is not alone there. Maybe you can consider this as some kind of storage, okay? And if your box is in there, that's nice because that will be quick to access. But now you have this whole hanger, this storage, you need to search. Where is my box? And so a naive way would be to look at all the locations in the hanger at the same time. And then if you find the box, okay, that's fine, and you can ship it to the factory. The problem is, of course, so if you would do this in a real factory, you would be fired probably, because this costs a lot of effort to do. If you want to check all the locations in the factory all the time for every box, this is not sustainable, costs a lot of resources. On a processor, it also costs a lot of resources, it costs a lot of power. So if you propose this at a chip manufacturing company, you would equally well be fired. So maybe we can think of a clever solution to this. What if we do something with the boxes or with the addresses of the boxes? Maybe we can assign a color to them. And so basically what we do is we constrain the set of locations we need to look for in this cache. In this case, this is represented by a color. So now we put the address of the box in this function. It spits out the blue color, so we know that if this box is in the cache, it will be in the blue set, and we only need to look in the blue set. And that's fantastic. Now, of course, our cache only has a limited size, right? So if a new box comes in, if a new pink box here comes in, there's something else that needs to go. And for that, the processor or the cache has this replacement policy, which is basically an algorithm that decides which line to kick out if a new one comes in. And this we will indicate with an arrow. So at any given point, this pink set has a line it will evict next. And the same holds for all of the other sets. Okay, so we have our factory, we have memory. Actually, I lied. So on modern processors, there's actually more than one factory which shares the same memory. And these can all be used in parallel. And then we have this magical cache object that I just described that's here. But as it turns out, and as you may have gathered from the floor plan I showed before, things are not so simple. And as it turns out, the best way to organize such a cache is actually in a relatively complicated hierarchy. And so you have different levels of cache in modern processors. So you have a level 1 cache close to the core, then a level 2 cache a bit bigger, last level cache much bigger, and this last level cache is typically shared between all of the factories. One important thing to note is, of course, that if the core needs something from memory that's slow, if it needs it from the last level cache, that's a bit faster, bit faster, bit faster. But bit faster means that if I measure the time it takes me to get a specific box from memory, the time will reveal in which cache, if any, that box was to be found. So there's a timing side channel here. How can we exploit that? Well, again, we have our hanger, but assume that now it's shared between a potential attacker and victim. So let's say they run on the same core, for instance, on the same factory. Well, then, of course, they're competing for the resources in this cache. And what an attacker could do is, for instance, through some mechanism, obtain a bunch of green boxes. And if an attacker does that, this is called an eviction set, then we can actually only, make abstraction of all the rest, and we can think only of this green set, these green boxes. So if an attacker exhausts all the capacity for the green color in this cache, then what the attacker can do is, it basically can answer the question, does another victim program access a green box? Let's say it didn't access a green box, then now an attacker can measure the access times to all of their own lines. This will all be fast. It's in the cache. It's not from memory. But let's say that the victim performed an access to a green box, then now, because of the limited size, one of the attacker lines has been evicted to memory, and now the attacker can time, this one is fast, this one is fast, this one is fast, that one is slow, instead of all lines being fast. So now an attacker infers the victim accessed a green box. And this is called a prime and probe attack. This is a type of cache side channel attack. And you can ask, well, what does answering this question about the green box give us in practice? Well, for instance, many code patterns take a similar shape as this. This is not too difficult, this piece of code. So if we have some secret information, if the secret is 0, the victim does something. If the secret is 1, the victim does something else. And in this case, the victim either accesses a pink or a green box. But now we know that we can answer the question, did the victim access a green box? So if the victim accessed a green box, an attacker with a prime and probe attack can infer that the victim used the key, or that the key of the victim is 1. So I want to reinforce, this is a side channel attack. You're not learning the contents of the boxes, you're only learning their color. And so this code pattern, you may think this is trivial, let's just not write code like this, but this is actually present in a lot of different code bases, like snippets or snippets like this. And they seem to be pesky to eradicate even in highly critical code. A reason why people thought it wasn't that bad is because of the magnitude of time we're talking about. So if we have an axis of time, right, where seconds is the piece of time that we're intimately familiar with. We live on the range of seconds. That's approximately the time it takes to say Mississippi. And then what we can also kind of imagine is a hummingbird flapping its wings. That's maybe every 10 milliseconds a hummingbird flaps its wings. The camera flash, maybe about a millisecond. But beyond that, it's hard to imagine anything that happens at that time scale. And then here is where we are with computer architectures. So we're talking about differences of nanoseconds. And so a nanosecond is 1/1000th of a second. Hard to conceive, and for a long time people thought, well, this small timing difference, that's not a problem, right? But it turns out it is. And so if we have attacker and victim sharing a computing platform, for instance, victim running on this core, attacker running on that core, we have this possibility of information leakage. And in the dissertation, which was here, but the copy just vanished, in that dissertation, I argue that the last level cache is the most important one to protect for several reasons. One is immediately apparent from this slide. If we attack the last level cache, we can attack people on other, or software on other cores. But it's also very high precision, low noise, and most of my efforts have been to either attack this last level cache and see what are the capabilities an attacker have, what's the best thing they can do in order to base our defenses against. And another key contribution I made, and which I will highlight also in this defense, is on the defensive side, because there have been several countermeasures proposed that protect this last level cache, and I evaluated their security and will present some conclusions about that as well. So now, I will present 4 highlighted papers from my PhD research. 2 are about attacks, so let's get into them right now. The first one is prime and scope. And this is a type of attack that should remind you of prime and probe. That's not coincidental. It's actually a variant of prime and probe that's a couple of order of magnitudes more efficient, well, more precise, depending on the exact circumstances. So we have this last level cache we want to attack. And Remember from the beginning I told you, okay, if a new line will come in, we will have to kick out another line. And there was this replacement policy with the arrow that decides which line will go. But prime and probe actually doesn't make any use of that. So prime and probe accesses all these lines as if they're indistinguishable from one another. So it cannot use this extra piece of information. But maybe if we're a bit more clever about this, we can use this extra piece of information. What if we attach a specific importance to this line? So we will call it the scope line, scope for microscope, being more accurate. What we can do is, well, if we can ensure that the scope line is the one that's next to be kicked out, we actually only have to measure accesses to the scope line. We don't have to access all these other memory addresses anymore. And this makes it a lot faster. But there's a problem, and that's of course, well, if you keep on accessing the same line, the processor will think, well, you need this line, so I'm going to keep it in the cache, I'm going to evict something else instead. So it's not possible to keep on measuring and measuring the same thing. So does that mean we cannot use this information at all? Well, maybe we can consider that actually the situation is more complex than this. There's also other cache levels in the picture. And imagine that we can somehow cook up a situation in which this scope line, as I call it, is the one to be kicked out in the last level cache, while at the same time also being present in the L1 cache. If it is possible at all to do this, then what you can do is an attacker can measure this line all the time, measure, 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 measure. This will be very fast, because all of these accesses are from L1. And what we've discovered is that actually, if the cache line is served from the L1 cache, this information does not propagate to the last level cache. So the line can be accessed over and over and over again without affecting this arrow here. And if we do it like that, okay, we can measure this line over and over again. And then as soon as a victim performs an access to a green box, this will evict it from the last level cache by means of the arrow, by definition. But this will actually also evict it from the L1 cache. And this is our prime and scope side channel, because now the scope line has been evicted. It needs to be served from memory, and that will be slow. Okay, so that's prime and scope. To summarize, there's one measurement step, and this measurement is very easy. We just access this scope line over and over and over again. The preparation is a bit more tricky, because now I said, yeah, we need to cook up this strange situation, and it's actually sending mixed signals to the processor. Because if we need this line to be the next one to be evicted in the last level cache, that means we need to communicate to the processor, I'm not using this line, you can soon evict it and get rid of it. But if we want to keep it in the L1 cache, we actually need to tell the processor, yeah, this line, I'm about to use it. So how is it even possible to achieve these two preconditions at the same time? And I wouldn't be presenting it here if the answer wasn't yes. And so we tested this out on, let's say, the last decade of Intel processors. And the green check mark obviously means, or is tied to the applicability of prime and scope on this platform. So it's widely applicable. And if we compare the precision, so the time precision, with state-of-the-art attacks, I'll decrypt the plot for you, is that we achieve a 50 times higher temporal precision than flush and reload. This is a state-of-the-art attack. This is used a lot. And roughly 10 times higher than the best instance of prime and probe. So the time precision, 50 times higher, what does that mean? Well, maybe we can draw a parallel to something we all know, and that's music. So if you're in a recording studio and you record music, what matters for both the quality of the music, but also what you're actually recording in terms of frequencies, is how often you sample, is how often you measure the music, basically. Now, assume we measure or sample a song at 200 Hertz. This only gives us the low frequencies, what doesn't change quickly. Well, what about if we increased the sample rate 50 times, just like what prime and scope would give us compared to flush and reload? Maybe then you can hear what the song is. temporal precision really gives you quite a lot. So that's prime and scope. Now on to the second main contribution, and that's a paper I call Double Trouble. Because what we wondered about, my colleague Furkan and I, was, okay, the last decade of Intel processors, we have all these attacks there, that's not fantastic. What about the next decade of Intel processors, or any processor for that matter? Will the situation be better in terms of security? And if we revisit this plot again, I told you before there's a problem, but there's actually, like, that was the memory bottleneck, that's a problem. If we solve that, there's actually a new problem, and that this curve is coming to an end. Okay, so if we want to continue this trend of getting more and more and more performance, we need to do something else, and that's to make dedicated hardware accelerators. Okay, this is also hardware, this is also things you can touch, but instead of being flexible like the CPU to perform any kind of operation, it's now specialized towards specific tasks. This task can be a crypto accelerator, crypto meaning both cryptography and the other thing, and AI, ML, all these other things can be accelerated. So that's something we will need if we want to continue this trend. So I claim, and we're seeing this trend also in the cloud, for instance, that if we have this integrated CPU like before, we have these accelerators that are attached. So I mentioned crypto accelerators, but this can also be network switching or FPGAs. So in our context, we investigated FPGAs. And they need to be integrated with the system somehow. Back in the day, they were attached to memory, so direct memory access, to interface with the cores. But right now, scrambling for performance, what we're seeing is that these accelerators are actually integrated in the last level cache. And this was exactly the component I told you about. This is going to be an important one to protect. And here you have one of the reasons. Well, all of these accelerators nowadays, they're attached to the last level cache. Doesn't sound too great, does it? There's one benefit, maybe, and that's for performance reasons. These accelerators are restricted in how they can interact with this last level cache. So they're not able to populate all of the lines in there, let's say. That's for performance reasons. But what we investigated in our double trouble work is what if, like in the cloud, so you can achieve this in the cloud, if you have CPU cores and an accelerator, for instance, an FPGA, if an attacker has both, can they do more than a conventional attacker that only has access to a core? And what we figure out is that actually, yes, they can do more. And these restrictions I talked about earlier actually show up as advantages to such a double trouble attacker. Allow me to get a little bit technical here. So some of these restrictions that apply are that this secondary device or this accelerator, if it performs reads, they don't end up in the cache at all. And if it performs writes, then these writes are only allocated to a specific region in the last level cache set. Notice I drew the set a bit bigger here. This is a restriction, so you cannot fill the whole cache set anymore. Another property that this secondary device has is that reads do not influence the replacement policy state, so this algorithm I talked about that decides which lines get evicted. And with our integrated FPGA-assisted reverse engineering process, we actually found very fine-grained ways or mechanisms for an attacker with surgical precision move these blocks, these cache lines, from different layers to one another. And this allows them, potential attackers, to achieve much finer control. We have a bunch of case studies in the paper, but one notable one is a construction of eviction sets, right? And this is basically the problem of, prior to an attack, getting boxes that are of the same color. And with our techniques, what we actually are able to do is use this accelerator not to accelerate genuine computations, but to actually, as a service, kind of accelerate the attack we're about to do. Okay, the second part of the contributions highlight is on the defensive avenue. So I I wrote 2 papers that I want to highlight and that are part of the dissertation about evaluating defenses. And what I'll say in the beginning is that defending against these types of attacks is tricky because they arise from performance optimizations that are well intended. So often killing the side channel also implies killing the performance optimization. So that's something we don't really want to do. So researchers are really trying to come up with ways to protect these components, these caches, without affecting performance too much. And there's 2 key promising low overhead countermeasures that were quite popular, either in the top venues in our field or already deployed in practice. And so these 2 promising countermeasures I had a look at and will now present the findings of. Because of course, if these countermeasures are going to be costly, then we want to know before we deploy them how much effect they will have and how important they can be. Our first work in this context is systematic analysis, and this is related to cache randomization. And so if we have our caches from before, a key insight is that maybe we can keep on sharing the cache, but make the interference more random, make it less predictable than before. And so one design proposed at Micro, so what basically changes here in this mapping function for before that spits out the color is that next to the address, we're also inputting something else. This could be a cryptographic key. And so this will randomize the location of the box in the cache, and maybe that helps us against attacks. In a similar vein, there's also been 2 other designs. A key difference is that they split the cache actually in different partitions. And another key difference is that they actually take some actual randomness, so a dice toss, let's say, when they decide where to place a line in the cache. So these were very promising designs, but for Caesar, and this is by the way not a typo, for Caesar it was quickly clear that it looks too much like a traditional cache, so it can kind of still be attacked like a traditional cache. But these other 2 designs, for these other 2 designs, it's much more difficult. And actually all of the conventional attacks, so all the attacks that existed prior to our work, they're all impossible, or let's say infeasible. And that's because conventional attacks, if we want to apply them to designs like this, we have to work with boxes that are that have the same color in each of these partitions of the cache. So if we want to attack this box, so if we want to know, did the victim access this box, what we need to do for conventional attacks is find other boxes that map to this set in this partition, that set in that partition, and that set in that partition. And if we, because this is a toy example, but if we do this for the caches we have nowadays in our processors, this is completely infeasible. So you would have to search that many addresses to get, in expected value, let's say, one that collides. This is clearly infeasible. That number is way too big. So one of our key insights is that maybe if we allow our attacks to be a bit weaker, if we allow our attacks to be probabilistic, maybe we can learn some useful information after all. And the basic idea is to not look for boxes that have the same color in every partition, but to look for some boxes that have the same color in partition 1, some other boxes that have the same color in partition 2, and then yet some other boxes that have the same color in partition 3, and so on for how many partitions there are. This makes it probabilistic because it's not necessarily because it maps, a box maps to the same set in this partition that will also be mapped there, because there's this randomness aspect that may also place it into another partition. And so using this probabilistic kind of approach or attack, there's one key problem here, and that's even if, so we can do an attack maybe probabilistically if we find boxes that satisfy this precondition, but finding these boxes, that was also an unsolved problem. And that's something we did, so that was estimated by these designs here, to take depending on the exact use case, but I think I'm fair in taking two examples out here. So one instance of Caesar S claims a continued attack resistance of 68 years to construct one of these eviction sets, and we actually construct one immediately, so in the first version of the key. And then for scatter cache, for one particular attack scenario, we reduce the time it takes to find an eviction set from 38 hours, sounds pretty infeasible, to 5 seconds. Maybe that's more on the feasible level. Now, of course, these attacks are under the assumption that this box here that produces the outputs, that one is perfectly secure. Okay? But yeah, this box needs to be implemented somehow. It's in a cache, so it needs to be fast. Maybe, you know, you can cut some corners here and there. So if you want to do it the proper way, you would use cryptography. So you would use a cryptographic algorithm that takes as input something comprehensible and then takes as output, produces as output something incomprehensible that cannot be tied back to the input anymore. But of course, as I mentioned, latency is critical because this is part of a cache. And so there have been some proposals for low latency block ciphers that maybe can be used here. But for some people, this is still too slow. So what if we cut some more corners? What if we propose our own design? And so this is something that, well-intendedly, the designers of Caesar did. And so they constructed this cryptographic function. The structure may sound familiar may look familiar to some of you. I mean, with the structure, I don't think there's anything wrong. But so the key goes in here. And then what I try to do, but I'm not a cryptanalyst, I don't know how these things work, but maybe we can get something useful out of it. So I entered these differences at the input and then computed, you know, pen and paper, like what happens if we apply these differences and if we propagate them all the way to the output. Maybe we can write up an equation that gives the differences from input to output. And if we set the output difference to 0, we have a collision, and that's what we need. And then so we have this equation here, and what may surprise you is that this is independent of the key. So somehow the key cancelled out throughout this entire procedure, at least if you write down the attack like I did, but yeah. Again, I'm not an expert. And this leads to a deterministic break of Caesar and Caesar S. So all the applies from before, all the attacks from before apply, but if you use the randomization function they propose, they're actually trivially broken immediately. So with this work, there's a bunch of math. So this is not the most mathy thing I did. The statistics was also quite mathy, but I tried to protect you from that in this defense. But this statistical analysis has been used, so these attack techniques have been used in several follow-up papers, some of them at really top venues. I'm also happy to say that there's been a lot of follow-up cache designs for which an explicit goal is to protect against the attacks I described. And then also we're seeing some proper tailored cryptography for this cache randomization use case, with which maybe we can achieve the latency we need without having a trivial break. And it's also in this context that I conducted an internship at Intel. That's also about this work. Final contribution I want to highlight is showtime, because there's one thing about timing attacks that we haven't really talked about yet, and that's well, an attacker is not holding a clock, right? So how are they doing these timing attacks? How do they get these fine-grained results they need, like in the order of nanoseconds? Well, we're actually just giving it to them. So basically, in any computing environment, you can get a fine-grained timer these days. So RDTSC natively in the browser, you can have performance.now. And initially, these had nanosecond precision. So what an attacker can do, this is again describing the timing attack. First ask, what time is it? Then perform an action. Ask, what time is it again? And then the difference will tell, for instance, if this cache access was a hit in the L1 or whether it came from memory. That's what this time tells you. But if we're making it so easy for the attacker, maybe we can try to make it a bit harder. So if we have our orders of magnitude of time here again, and we have our fine-grained timers, maybe remove all timers altogether. And then there cannot be any timing attack without a timer. Well, it turns out that removing all the timers is quite tricky because some programs really need access to time. But maybe we can make the resolution a lot lower. Maybe we give them access to timing sources that have maybe 100 microseconds, a millisecond resolution. And this has been proposed academically for the first time, I think about a decade ago. But this is actually deployed in all major browsers nowadays. So if you do a timing call in a browser, the most accurate you're going to get is roughly in this direction. And this makes the attacker's life miserable, of course, because now if you have a coarse-grained timer, you want to time how long a specific action takes. Yeah, well, these timing differences are too small. You're not going to see it with a timer that's this coarse. So is there nothing else we can do? And that's the subject of our work. What if we can somehow amplify these timing differences such that even this coarse-grained timer gives us a timing difference we can work with? And something important about this amplifier is that actually you can see this as a piece of code that takes a wildly different time to execute based on a very fragile initial condition. So this initial condition is if a line is cached, this piece of code will take not a long time. If the single cache line is not cached, it will take a very long time. And in the paper, we have two implementations of such amplifiers, so to prove that it's possible to make them. And both of them rely, again, on this replacement policy, right, that we described in the beginning. The first one, for the first one, the basic principles we didn't discover, but a team at Google did. But then we were able to improve how much it amplifies, basically, the initial time. So in this case, a slow run of this single-shot amplifier takes twice as long as a fast run. And this one is nice because it also works in the browser. This one only works natively, but here it's very strong. So a slow instance of this single-shot amplifier takes 10 times longer than a fast instance, which makes it actually quite robust. So we tried it out, and then we saw, okay, can we produce from a single cache hit or miss a timing difference of 1 microsecond? Okay, yes, we can. 10 microseconds, 100 microseconds. This is the resolution you get in Google Chrome. A millisecond, 10 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds. Oh, this is quite robust. Because recall, we're starting from an initial timing difference of about 100 nanoseconds or less. And this kind of gets into the human perceptible range, so the seconds range. So we tried this out with some fellow humans in the hardware group. And so we exposed them to an experiment where they had to view these instances. So they had a terminal, they view these instances of the single-shot amplifier, and then have to classify, does this belong to an initial cache hit or to an initial cache miss? And we're happy to say that we have very capable humans in the hardware group. So an average accuracy of 98%, that's more than some native timing, some direct timing sources give you. The median was 99%, and then for some people I'm wondering whether they're human at all, because they achieved an accuracy of about 100%. So we have these insane timing differences we can produce, and so if we put that into perspective, going from 100 nanoseconds to 1 second, that's about a 10 million times increase. So if I would now talk 10 million times slower, we would be here for quite a while. But luckily that's not the case, and we've reached the part of the presentation where I can wrap up my contributions. So I described prime and scope, which is a drop-in replacement for prime and probe. It's the most temporally high-precision attack known to date. That was the one with the music, in case you forgot about the song. We also asked the question, well, what about the future of cache attacks? Will it get better or worse? Our conclusion is probably that it will get a bit worse because we have this additional complexity, this heterogeneity, this attack surface. And here we actually, as I mentioned, turn restrictions into advantages. So if that's what's really happening, then it may be tough to mitigate against. We also looked at cache randomization, where we first analyzed designs statistically, and we answered the question, well, are they as secure as they claim? Well, probably not. And we also asked the second question, and that's, should you roll your own crypto? Yeah, and I won't humiliate you by answering it. And then, of course, in our final work that I highlighted today, that's showtime, and there we showed that these minuscule timing differences we talked about can almost be arbitrarily amplified. So we need to revisit these time restrictions if we really want to use it as a holistic countermeasure. And with that, I would like to thank you and move on over to the Q&A part of the defense.